This is a response to Creation Museum's video, Bill Nye, Creationism is highly appropriate for our children. Well, as promised, it's time to roll up my sleeves and get down to dealing with the intellectual powerhouses of the creationist cesspool known as Answers in Genesis, and more specifically what they had to say about Bill Nye and his Big Think video. But before we begin, I think we should frame this video with a little context. You see, on his AIG blog, Mr. Ham proudly announced the excretion of this video graphic offering by introducing his marionettes as follows, and I quote,
"These two PhD scientists were asked to reply to Mr. Nye, whose academic credentials don't come close to Drs. Menton and Purdom."
Well, this was indeed a bold claim by the shitflinger-in-chief, and since he's quite used to people unwisely taking his word for all manner of preposterous propositions, I'm sure that he expected everyone reading his blog to do the same. Well, unfortunately for him, I don't operate that way, so I thought it would be best to investigate the backgrounds of these two scientific colossi to make everyone fully aware of who we're dealing with and exactly how qualified they are to claim that they know better than the most brilliant minds in science, both past and present. As you'll shortly discover, my investigation led me to forming an opinion of these two individuals that's somewhat less than favourable, since they've apparently been more enthusiastic about spending their lives shitting all over science instead of promoting or doing it. As a result, I'm afraid that referring to them as doctor may lead to me choking on my own words, and since I can't rely on any of my viewers knowing the Heimlich manoeuvre, I'll instead be using some more appropriate sobriquets for them. We'll begin with Georgia Purdom, née Hickman, aka Tweedledum. Miss Dum received a PhD in molecular genetics from Ohio State in 2000, and a quick search through the literature reveals that she's published a grand total of 3 peer-reviewed papers, none of which interestingly appear from her tenure as a scientist at AIG. And while this might en face seem abnormally respectable for a creationist, unfortunately for Miss Dum, her contributions apparently only merited third-place authorship on all 3 publications. Since established convention dictates that other than the principal investigator whose name appears last, authors are ranked in order of their relative contributions, coming out of a PhD with only 3rd authorships really is a quite pitiful showing and tantamount to nothing short of, and I apologize for using technical terms here, a dismal and unmitigated fucking failure. And then we have David Menton, aka Tweedledee. Now at the onset I'll admit that his record is substantially superior to Miss Dum's abysmal qualifications, and in fact a cursory glance at his bio on the AIG website might even convince the casual observer that it's impressive. Mr. D received his PhD from Brown, a prestigious Ivy League institution, followed by a 40-year career, 34 of which were at Washington University in St. Louis. From what I could discover from PubMed and the Web of Science, over those decades he produced a grand total of 27 papers. Now that might seem impressive to the uninitiated, but let's back up and put that into context, shall we? I consider myself at best a middle-of-the-road scientist and have my name on 16 papers in the 18 years since I received my PhD. That's an average of 0.89 per year compared to Mr. Dumb's 0.68, but considering that I've spent 16 of those 18 years working in industry and so haven't been able to publish the majority of my research, while Mr. Dumb has spent the bulk of his at a premier research university where publication is practically compulsory, his contribution begins to shrink even more and suggests that the only reason he stuck it out there for so long was because of an unfortunate calamity that occurred during the assignment of tenure, since the record seems to indicate that he is what bona fide academics affectionately refer to as dead wood. In this light, it's interesting to note that while the AIG website proudly provides a link to Mr. D's creationist scribbling, it doesn't do so for his legitimate work, making one wonder whether Mr. Ham also realizes that Mr. D's wood could do with a spot of Viagra. And if that assessment seems harsh, let's compare myself and Mr. Dumb to a real scientist. In this case, Professor James Rothman at Yale, someone who's won the Lasker Medal and is in the running for a Nobel, and who in 40 years has published 242 papers, or over 6 a year. Furthermore, Jim's citation index, an average of how often his papers are referenced by others and so a measure of their importance in the field, is a whopping 165, dwarfing my 76 but by nowhere near as much as Mr. Dumb's sad and shriveled 25. Now, I'm aware that this protracted introduction may lead to accusations of ad hominem argumentation and of poisoning the well, so I want to make it clear that my intent isn't to discredit their arguments and assertions by proxy, because I'll be dealing with those in turn shortly. Instead, because of Mr. Ham's use of his blog to imply an argument from authority, I felt it important to point out exactly how qualified these individuals actually are, since not everyone is aware that not all PhDs are created equal. So in summary, from my perspective, if someone of the stature of a Jim Rothman were to come to me and claim that some well-established area of biology was erroneous, I would at the very least be obliged to take some time to hear them out. When on the other hand the seemingly unending line of pseudo and unqualified creationist numbnuts, of which the Tweedles are our latest example, do the same, I expect them to either immediately produce empirical evidence and some very strong arguments, or to fuck right off because their pitiful qualifications mean absolutely jack shit to me.
The first point that Bill Nye makes is that denial of evolution is unique to the United States. I'm sure he knows better than that. After all, not only is evolution criticized widely in the United States by at least 40% of its citizens, but evolution is believed to be false in the Muslim world. Creationism is certainly taught in South Africa, India, South Korea, Brazil. Smaller factions of creationists probably are found in Japan, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada.
Ah, the argumentum ad populum. Nice start, D. While I admit that Bill Nye could have chosen his words more carefully, it should be quite clear that what he meant was that the United States is the only place in the developed world where dumb fucks like you are taken seriously by a substantial number of the population, and where there is a danger that you might actually do some significant harm. And while you did acknowledge that your insanity is all too prevalent in the US, you didn't mention that your compatriots in most of those other countries are marginalized by the populace as the delusional loons they are, presumably because that would hardly add to the impression you try to create here by dishonestly trying to overstate the acceptance of your buffoonery worldwide. Well, D, I regret to inform you that the fact that the world is liberally sprinkled with the demented dumbfucks that can be referred to by the catch-all creationists doesn't validate nor in any way diminish the magnitude of your fucktardation. It merely demonstrates that you're not the only cretin on the planet, and that the rest of us have yet another reason to despair at the state of our species. Thus, if you want your pronouncements to receive even a small modicum of respect, you might want to consider spending some time putting that alleged science background to use and doing some actual experimental research to back up your bullshit, rather than resorting to vacuous and fallacious argumentation.
Bill Nye implies in his video that parents and other adults are doing a great disservice to children by teaching them about biblical creation. Well, you might be interested to know that I also teach my young daughter about evolution, and I know many other Christian parents who do the same.
Well, Dumb, I already told your organ grinder in Holy Hallucinations 34, if you think that sane people believe that you and your fellow intellectual cripples are teaching your children anything other than a deliberately inaccurate and shoddily constructed straw man of evolutionary theory, then you've got another thing coming. The veracity of my conjecture will be bolstered shortly when I deal with some of your other comments, but before we move on, I thought it would be illuminating to compare what the Reverend Ham said about creationist pedagogy in his first video,
Creationists are teaching children that they're special,
with what you said in your interview with Michael Shermer on his recent visit to the Creation Museum.
All of us have sinned, even a 1-year-old child. I have a 5-year-old daughter. She's a guilty sinner.
I have to say that this shines as clear a light as I've ever seen on the magnitude of the mental illness that you delusional and deliberately ignorant buffoons are suffering from. Not only have you managed to convince yourselves that your woefully inadequate brains are in some way superior to some of the greatest minds of the present and the past, but you're also so profoundly stupid that you're unable to maintain even a scrap of internal consistency within the childish fantasy that you've constructed and are trying to pass off as a worldview. If this is any indication of the kind of education you're providing your daughter, then I feel like crying for her.
children that they're special,
She's a guilty sinner.
children that they're special,
She's a guilty sinner.
children that they're special.
She's a guilty sinner. Children should be exposed to both ideas concerning our past. Being a good scientist and a mom, I want my daughter to be educated about evolution so that she can see the inherent problems with it. For example, the complete lack of a genetic mechanism that allows organisms to gain genetic information to go from simple to complex over time.
As I've already demonstrated, you, madam, are as far away from being a good scientist as I am from winning the nicest knockers on YouTube award. As for being a good mom, well, I have no reason to doubt that you're doing a fine job tending to her physical well-being, but as we've already seen, any claims that you're doing the same for her psychological and educational welfare would be dubious at best. As for your example, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this particular crock of shit being enthusiastically filled by creationists. This is generally because, in the supreme confidence born of their seemingly endless ignorance, they're completely unaware of or just deliberately ignoring the phenomenon of gene duplication, which has been documented countless times and occurs via mechanisms as diverse as genome or chromosome duplication, transposition, retrotransposition, unequal crossover, and chromosomal breakage and fusion. And while I might excuse this oversight by an irredeemable fucktard like Nephilim Free, whose brain appears to have been replaced by a walnut that was shat out by a choleriac squirrel, you don't have that luxury because you hold a PhD in molecular genetics, a PhD that now seems as deserved as Ian Juby's Mensa membership. This assertion alone not only confirms my suspicions of the kind of evolutionary education you're providing your daughter with, but proves that you're nothing but a vile and loathsome, filthy liar. I know that if I were in a position of power at Ohio State, I'd be doing everything I could to revoke that PhD from you, Miss Dumb. But since I'm not, the best I can do is to tell you to take your disgusting lie and shove it up your arsehole until you feel it tickling your tonsils.
Bill Nye also makes the comment that the world becomes fantastically complicated if one believes in creation. I would argue the world becomes fantastically complicated if one believes in evolution. You see, in evolution, you have to look at that hummingbird feeding at your feeder and assume that all of its parts have somehow come together by random purposeless change combined with natural selection, which is nothing more than differential reproduction.
You can argue all you like, Dee, but that doesn't mean that those of us who know better won't smell your bullshit from halfway across the internet. You see, despite the equivocation of your version of the word belief, that is, the blind, unquestioning acceptance of propositions and the complete absence of evidence, or in your case, despite over a century of evidence to the contrary, and that used by people whose diplomas aren't printed on toilet paper, that is, the provisional acceptance of propositions based on empirical and verifiable evidence, I'm afraid that Mr. Nye made a valid point. The complexity of evolution you describe is due to the inevitable intricacy of emergent properties resulting from the interaction of effectively infinite numbers of infinitesimal particles that nevertheless can be understood using relatively crude mathematically tractable approximations of their behavior. And while it could be argued that your perspective is infinitely simpler because you can and do explain everything with an intellectually lazy and vacuous appeal to the magic of a shaman in the sky, I believe the complexities Mr. Nye was referring to were the psychological contortions creationists must go through to keep their heads from dislodging from the comfort of their gluteal resting places. From the bizarre and frankly profoundly retarded ad hoc explanations you're forced to continually devise as yet more evidence in support of evolutionary theory is uncovered, to your almost supernatural ability to ignore said evidence when it's all but kicking you repeatedly in the balls to attract your attention, to having to continually run from here to there like demented simpletons to cover up the cracks showing up in your ramshackled explanations, to being forced to lie like a rabbi caught at the breakfast bar at Denny's to cover up the fact that you have no evidence to support your claims, and a world of evidence that's pounding them up the arse as hard and as fast as Donald Trump chasing after his hair on a windy day. And all of this just to deny an elegant, beautifully self-consistent reality that occurs through observed and observable physical processes in favor of a fantastical and evidently erroneous alternative that relies on the evocation of supernatural events that have never been observed by anybody.
We need to understand in the video that Bill Nye is confusing observational science with historical science. Observational science is what I call here and now science. It gives us inventions and technology like computers and vaccines. We can observe it, test it, and repeat it. Historical science deals with the past, and both evolution and creation fall into that category. We cannot test, observe, or repeat them.
So here we go with the historical and observable science bullshit I promised your paymaster I'd eventually deal with. I'll begin by saying that this distinction is a completely arbitrary one used to describe the differences between disciplines that are aimed at understanding events that occurred in the past versus ones that seek to explain events that we can observe occurring in the present. It is just as arbitrary as those between, say, physical and biological sciences, or between quantum and classical physics, or between plant and animal biology. These dichotomies are the result of human language and our brain's propensities for categorization. They provide useful distinctions for the purposes of communication, but no serious scientist believes any of them, yours included, represent fundamental divides in the scientific enterprise. Because while different fields may indeed require different experimental or observational approaches or methodologies and different conceptual paradigms, they all follow the same systematic approach towards investigating the nature of the physical world. The only reason mentally and emotionally stunted oafs like you make this distinction isn't because of a demarcation of the past and present that somehow presents an insurmountable epistemic barrier, but rather and solely because what we've learnt about the past runs contrary to the primitive fables you desperately wish to cling to for succor. I think I can safely posit this as being true because I don't recall ever hearing any creationist numbnut opining on the virtues of observational over futuristic science, while simultaneously warning us of the evils of listening to the Weather Channel or of trusting NASA with when and where to see the next solar eclipse. Furthermore, despite your assertions to the contrary, it seems that the global mining industry disagrees with your assessment and in fact spends hundreds of millions of dollars on geologists to locate new reserves of minerals and fossil fuels based on their knowledge of historical science and an ancient Earth, and then billions of dollars more on exploration based on their advice. I find it very amusing, therefore, that the very sciences and discoveries you have the temerity to deny are the same ones that allow you to gas up your car so you can drive your useless ass to church on a Sunday to talk to the ceiling. Once you and your fellow simpletons use your creation science to come up with an alternative to finding these reserves that amounts to more than sticking a pin in a map and praying to Jesus for a bit of luck, and once you get Exxon to start paying you to do it, then maybe I'll take some time to actually listen to you. In the meantime, I'd like to ask you to kindly stop crapping so enthusiastically on the work and achievements of those who make your worthless lives better and just shut the fuck up.
Yes, we do see fossils and distant stars, but their history of how they got here really depends on our worldview. Do we start with man's ideas about the past who wasn't here during the supposed billions of years of Earth history? Or do we start with the Bible, the written revelation of the eyewitness account of the eternal God who created it all? Rather than being inconsistent, as Bill Nye states, observational science confirms the literal history and Genesis.
Of course, you didn't have the courtesy to support that bold assertion by spending any time explaining how observational science confirms this literal history, so in the absence of such revelations, I'm going to assume that you were referring to the same derisible bullshit the creationists have been trying to pass off as shanola for decades. This bullshit, of course, includes that unsubstantiated assertion that your book is an eyewitness account and not an allegory, which I might remind you the vast majority of Christians find just as pungent as I do. So as far as I'm concerned, you can take that assertion and insert it as vigorously as possible so it can keep your lie on gene duplication company. As for your ideas on perspective, perhaps this is a good time for me to point out yet again that just 400 years ago pretty much everyone started off with your worldview. Fortunately for our species, though, enough enlightened and intellectually honest religious inquirers didn't ignore the evidence in favor of clinging to their original biblical notions, and instead followed that evidence to its inevitable conclusion. This apparently slipped your notice, perhaps because you were too busy reading your Bible during your graduate and undergraduate studies rather than the textbooks that might have actually taught you something new and turned you into a productive human being instead of an organic device for wasting oxygen. Thus, for your information, these man's ideas about the past you refer to all began with your worldview. It's just that intelligent people who are capable of objectively viewing the evidence and coming to rational and reasoned conclusions realized that it was fundamentally flawed and moved on, leaving morons like you to go on living in the past like sniveling children clinging to the skirts of the beliefs that they find most comforting rather than standing up like adults and following them into the light.
The second point that Bill makes in his video is that evolution is fundamental to all life science, that life science can't be practiced without it. This is certainly not the case.
Well, as much as it pains me to do so, Dee, I shall have to agree with the words you said, but not with the spirit behind them, which I will now proceed to roll up and slowly insert back where it belongs. It is indeed true that isolated aspects of biological sciences can be practiced without resorting to evolutionary theory, but only to a limited degree. More specifically, those aspects are involved with describing and elucidating the mechanisms of life. We don't need evolutionary theory to sequence a genome, to determine a sequence of events in a signal transduction cascade, or to elucidate the molecular transformations occurring during enzymatic catalysis. But what you missed out is that without the theory of evolution, we simply can't explain why we see what we do. Without evolution, we can't explain the striking patterns of similarities and differences between the genomes of different organisms. Without evolution, we can't explain why some pathways are redundant or why components can be functionally substituted between diverse organisms. And without evolution, we can't explain why enzyme homologs from different species possess very different activities. So while you certainly can describe biological systems in a vacuum, the principle that Mr. Nye was articulating is that you cannot develop a deep and unifying explanation for these observations outside of the framework of evolutionary theory. I can see why this doesn't occur to you because you appear to have pretty much been an anatomist and histologist before you sold your soul to the Antipodean devil, and so probably fell into that shrinking class of anachronistic stamp collectors who are content to simply catalogue natural phenomena rather than seeking to explain them. This inability to transition into doing true exploratory research may explain why your career fizzled out so pitifully, and also why you seem to be unable to comprehend the bigger picture Mr. Nye was alluding to.
The evolutionist Adam Wilkins, publishing in Bioessays, Volume 22, number 12, says as follows.
I stopped it here to quickly note my amusement at you referring to Dr. Wilkins as an evolutionist. I'm sure you did this to give the dishonest impression that biologists are divided into two camps on this issue, when I'm sure you're aware that something like 99.8% of biologists and earth scientists accept evolutionary theory as being broadly correct. So this little trick hardly reflects well on you. In fact, the only impression you left on me is that of a lying, deceptive, filthy, and probably flatulent toad. So with that said, let's move on and see what inevitable act of outrageous mendacity I'm sure you're preparing to perpetrate on Dr. Wilkins.
While the great majority of biologists would probably agree with Theodosius Dobzhansky that nothing in biology makes sense without evolution, yet he said most can conduct their work quite happily without particular reference to evolutionary ideas. He concluded that evolution would appear to be an indispensable and unifying idea, and at the same time, a highly superfluous one.
Unfortunately, Dee, what you neglected to do was read the very next paragraph, which I will now do for you. Yet the marginality of evolutionary biology may be changing. More and more issues in biology, from diverse questions about human nature to the vulnerability of ecosystems, are increasingly seen as reflecting evolutionary events. Furthermore, you also mysteriously didn't mention that whole issue of bioessays was dedicated to articles about those events and, I quote, the ways they shape the properties of living things from bacteria to humans. So there's not much more to say, is there, Dee, except for me to tell you that this is perhaps as egregious and underhanded a quote mine as I think I've ever had the misfortune to come across. And to ask what kind of repulsive and disgusting motherfucker thinks that this kind of repugnant behavior is even vaguely acceptable in a supposedly civil society. That was a rhetorical question, of course, because the answer is the same as it's always been, and that's a creationist. The fact that you seem to be so stupid as to think that no one would look up the reference you gave does make me suspect that, as with the video your boss crapped out, This was targeted at the poor fools who are in the habit of taking your claims and your derisible qualifications seriously, and not to people who are prepared to use their brains for more than generating cash from morally bankrupt Australian shitbags. Thus, I'd like to make it clear, lest you or your fellow dimwits choose to make a return to YouTube in order to do the same thing again, that I will be waiting to ensure that you'll at least have to do so at the expense of your dignity. So now that we're done, I'd like to draw this to a close by thanking both Tweedledum and Tweedledee for affording me the opportunity to yet again demonstrate the levels to which creationists are ever willing to stoop to preserve their stupefying childishness, to show how fervently they lie and mislead at the drop of a hat in the name of their God, and to expose how pitiful and impotent that God must be if it has to rely on that kind of behavior and these kinds of wretched and woefully inept creatures to rally to its defense.